Hello everyone. Today I want to tell you the story of how a single sound plunged the entire world into mystery. In the summer of 1997, scientists at the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were reviewing a signal that had appeared on their equipment, and they froze right where they stood. It was the loudest underwater sound ever recorded on Earth. The problem was, nobody knew where it came from or what had made it. That sound is called the bloop. It's not an official scientific term, just a nickname. It was a name NOAA researchers used internally, and it eventually spread across the internet until that's what everyone called it. If you look closely at the shape of the sound, it was a signal whose frequency rose steadily for about 1 minute, then cut off abruptly. Now, just how loud was this sound? It was picked up simultaneously by multiple hydrophones more than 4,800 kilometers apart. To put that in perspective, 4,800 kilometers is farther than the distance from Seoul to the southern tip of Southeast Asia. The sound was detected across that entire distance. When they triangulated the source for a precise location, the origin was estimated to be somewhere in the middle of the South Pacific, around 50 degrees south latitude, 100 degrees west longitude. Why was this so shocking? Up to that point, the loudest known sound from any marine animal was the blue whale, coming in at 188 to 191 decibels. That's 188 to 191 decibels at its peak. Bloop was on a level that exceeded even that. NOAA researchers immediately looked into the possibility of a biological origin, but in terms of sheer volume alone, this was a sound that no known marine creature could produce. It simply defied explanation. That's exactly where the unknown giant creature theory caught fire on the internet. But here's the thing. The equipment that detected the bloop was no ordinary gear, not even close. Let me give you a bit of background here. This story actually begins with an underwater acoustic monitoring system that was planted in the ocean during the Cold War. It's called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System and Underwater Acoustic Surveillance Network. In the early 1950s, the US Navy commissioned AT&T and Western Electric to develop this seafloor detection network with the goal of tracking Soviet submarines. It started with a test facility in 1952, with 40 hydrophones planted 440 meters below the ocean surface near the Bahamas, and was later expanded across the Atlantic and Pacific. When the Cold War ended, the US Navy began sharing SOSUS data with NOAA starting in 1990. Military data had now landed in the hands of scientists. Then, starting in 1996, NOAA PMAL deployed additional autonomous underwater hydrophones, called HARU, across the equatorial Pacific to supplement SOSUS. It was that HARU network that captured the bloop in 1997. Now, the part I find most fascinating about all of this is the depth at which these hydrophones were installed. They were placed in a layer called the SOFAR channel, between 600 and 1,200 meters below the surface. Let me explain what the SOFAR channel actually is. At around 1,000 meters depth in the ocean, there's a layer where the speed of sound reaches its minimum value. Sound waves refract upward and downward around this axis and bounce back, effectively creating a natural waveguide. Because of this, low-frequency signals can travel thousands of kilometers with almost no energy loss. That's the physical reason why the bloop could be picked up by hydrophones more than 5,000 kilometers away. All right, let's break down the signal itself. Here's what the bloop spectrum looked like when analyzed. It was a broadband signal spanning roughly 1 Hz up to 440 Hz. 1 Hz is below the 20 Hz threshold of human hearing, so no one could hear the original sound directly. That's why the bloop audio that NOAA released is played back at 16 times speed. Speed it up 16 times and it finally falls within the range the human ear can hear. But here's what's interesting about that. At 16x speed, it sounds like some living creature crying out. That impression spread across the internet and poured fuel on the unknown monster theory. But the actual physical characteristics of the signal directly clashed with the biological origin hypothesis. Blue whale calls are typically narrowband signals, concentrated in the 15 to 40 Hz range. The bloop was different, starting from 1 Hz as a broadband signal. NOAA researcher Christopher Fox had already said in a 2001 CNN interview that the sound was most likely the noise of glacial calving. At the time, there wasn't enough comparative data to confirm that. So no conclusion could be reached, and when the story went public through a New Scientist article in 2002, it actually hardened into a mystery instead. Right? So you're probably wondering how the identity was finally figured out. This is where the real story begins. The clue to the answer came from a completely unexpected place. NOAA PMEL had installed a hydrophone network in the Scotia Sea and began recording ice sounds at a large scale. The Scotia Sea is the body of water between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, and it's a major travel corridor for large icebergs. These hydrophones began accumulating recordings of the sounds made when icebergs crack and break apart. And as researchers were analyzing those signals, they found broadband spectra starting from 1 Hz, lasting about 1 minute, with rising frequency patterns strikingly similar to the bloop. It was essentially the same pattern as the bloop. PMEL acoustics team leader Bob Giac officially confirmed the frequency and duration characteristics of the bloop match the icequake signals we've recorded in Antarctica. They are essentially identical. In the end, as the comparative data from scientists studying ice sounds accumulated, the puzzle began to come together. The decisive moment arrived in 2008. PMEL researchers successfully tracked the disintegrating iceberg A53A near South Georgia Island in real time, using acoustic signals alone. The sounds A53A produced as it broke apart were detected by hydrophones thousands of kilometers away, and the spectrum was nearly indistinguishable from the 1997 bloop. Why does that matter? Because this wasn't speculation. It was direct, real-time confirmation that a large iceberg breaking apart generates an ultra-low frequency, high-volume signal. The acoustic energy released during calving, the process of glacial separation, produces broadband signals that travel simultaneously through water, air, and the Earth's crust. To give you a sense of the scale, large glacial calving events can trigger seismic waves equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake or greater. In extreme cases, the signal shows up on seismographs thousands of kilometers away. That's exactly why Antarctica has been identified as a major source of low-frequency background noise across the southern Indian and Pacific Oceans. In 2002, NOAA finally released the official explanation for the bloop. Non-structural polar ice quake, that is iceberg calving or an iceberg scraping the seafloor caused by glacial movement, is the source of the bloop. It was a conclusion that took 15 years to reach, counting from 1997. Based on acoustic azimuth analysis, the iceberg that generated the bloop was most likely located somewhere between the Bransfield Strait and the Ross Sea, or near Cape Adare. That explanation is now stated on NOAA's official website. But why did the research take 15 years? It wasn't simply a matter of analysis time. When the bloop occurred, the acoustic database of Antarctic ice sounds hadn't been built up sufficiently yet. It was only after the bloop that PML researchers seriously expanded their detection networks around Antarctic waters like the Scotia Sea. And it wasn't until years of accumulated data provided a basis for comparison that spectrum matching became possible. The scientific conclusion wasn't a matter of simple calculation. It was a matter of accumulating comparable data. That's the part of this story that left the deepest impression on me. It wasn't a mystery because there was no answer. It was a mystery because there was no data to confirm the answer. Now, just because a conclusion was reached doesn't mean everything is neatly explained. There are still loose ends. First, let's talk about the triangulation coordinates. The original triangulated location of the bloop was 50 degrees south, 100 degrees west. But that's thousands of kilometers away from the most likely source area NOAA currently points to, somewhere between the Bransfield Strait and Cape Adar. NOAA explains the discrepancy as error from the limitations of the early triangulation method. When you back-calculate the origin of a signal that traveled more than 5,000 kilometers, and you only have a limited number of receiving hydrophones, the margin of error can be significant. So the precise origin still remains a range estimate, not a single set of coordinates. On the internet, though, this coordinate mismatch got interpreted in a very different direction. It turned out that the fictional location of R'lyeh, the sunken city where H.P. Lovecraft's imaginary entity Cthulhu sleeps, was set at coordinates that happened to be close to the bloop's triangulated position. It was a coincidence, but combined with the unknown giant creature theory, it exploded into a meme. In the end, through Reddit and YouTube, the bloop became the defining example of a strange phenomenon where the mystery never goes away even after science has provided an answer. In the Subnautica fan community, creature designs inspired by the bloop even started appearing. And beyond the bloop, NOAA and PML's acoustic monitoring programs have recorded other unidentified underwater sounds, including Julia, train, upsweep, and slowdown. Some of these still have no officially confirmed source. The upsweep signal has been recorded continuously since 1991, with volcanic activity proposed as a possible cause, but its origin remains unconfirmed. The bloop is the only sound on that list of mysterious signals that has been fully explained. And at the same time, this story is also an example of how a Cold War artifact ended up being used for something completely different. After SOSUS was declassified, NOAA researchers made the first ever real-time observation of an undersea volcanic eruption in 1993, and acoustic tracking of iceberg movement became possible too. Without that infrastructure, the bloop might never have been detected at all. That 1-minute sound that rang out from the middle of the South Pacific in the summer of 1997. That signal, detected across more than 4,800 kilometers, turned out to be the sound of a glacier breaking apart. The answer came through 15 years of time, the legacy of the Cold War, and the infrastructure and data built up along the way. And yet mysteries like the coordinate mismatch are still floating around somewhere on the internet. The ocean hasn't told us everything yet,